Welcome to Totally Talent Podcast by HR.com, your go-to source for all things talent. Whether you're looking for expert insights on high-volume hiring, the latest trends in recruitment technology, or strategies for building a winning team, we've got you covered. Join us for each episode as we dive deep into the challenges and opportunities shaping the talent landscape today. Let's get started.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Totally Talent on HR.com. I'm your host, Mike Wood, and I have a very special guest today. He's the CEO of Fama, Mr. Ben Mones, like bonus. How are you?
What's up, Mike? I'm doing great. Happy Friday. And great to be back on the pod, ready to chat today.
Yeah, and I'm in a great mood because I'm going on vacation next week. So fantastic. But first, before I go on vacation, I want to talk about what you guys do. So can you just give me like a little, let's tell the listeners what Fama does if they haven't seen you out in the space.
Yeah, sure. So Fama, we're a software company in the talent screening space. And, functionally what we do is bring the dimension of who somebody is in text, image, and video in a compliant fashion into the talent screening process, whether that's pre-employment, existing employee screening. Companies turn to us when they want to expand the scope of their screening strategy to kind of reflect what is largely now a digital native workforce. So finding ways to answer the same old questions talent acquisition leaders have always had around, character, leadership, alignment, identifying workplace misconduct, but doing it in a way that focuses on the online record as opposed to the analog, again, to reflect kind of today's workforce. And that's me. Yeah. I'm the CEO and founder of the company. So.
That's great. So like, I love that you're keeping an eye on people in they're putting stuff out publicly on social media. So it's not like you're invading their space. These are people that are putting stuff out publicly. But if it's going to hurt your brand, you got to know that it's happening. Someone could be a complete paper tiger. They could be great, in interviewing, and then they get at your company, and then you find out that they have this other life where they argue with people on the internet about like cultural stuff. And especially nowadays, you don't need that. So I love the ongoing monitoring that you do. Mm-hmm. And I think, so I talked to McCall a lot, and she's on your team, and she's doing a lot of stories about like kind of like nightmare scenarios. And sure. So you got to have one off the top of your head, I believe. So why did you even start this?
Happy to talk through it. And it's interesting, kind of come back to it later, but sort of difference between how people think about this solution from like a pre-employment screening versus ongoing, workforce screening, right? And what that might look like. The parameters are quite different. We can kind of touch on exactly how that manifests. But, Fama, I started the company because I missed something on a new hire long time ago, more than 15 years ago at this point. A guy that we thought was a great fit for a role. We bring him on board. A few months into the job, he ends up sexually harassing one of our top salespeople at the company. Horrible experience for this woman, for the business. But after the fact, we see on this guy's social media all this like pejorative, misogynistic content about women that had we seen it, we never would have hired him, right? And so that's really, I would say a good proxy and a good story of how Fama operates today from a pre-employment standpoint is that, yeah, to your point, the way that, companies think about, hiring, that's things they've always cared about, right? Identifying whether or not somebody's going to act intolerant towards others, right? If they're going to threaten, act harassing towards people, if they've openly, kind of evangelized like illegal drug use. If someone talked about being high in a job interview, for example, employers would know what to do with that information. But at the same time, you can do that and extract that via the online record, right? And so when it comes to monitoring, what's a little bit different when we think about, kind of talent screening more generally, is that clients are very concerned, not about, a person's point of view, even if it might be like offensive towards other employees as much, but really things like workplace violence, criminal activity, right? So when you talk about war stories and things that we've seen, last year, we stopped a workplace shooter on behalf of one of our customers. So, there are real examples of employers who are either talking about stealing, thieving, getting high at work, or in the worst case, making violent threats against other people, and being able to intervene on that before it becomes a material and significant issue for an organization and for the people that work for you. That's really the value prop of existing employee screening. So think of like folks casting kind of a wider net at the front of the funnel before they bring somebody in. But, once you're in, there's I think a greater trust contract where customers are, more concerned about the serious violations that could have either like a safety or regulatory impact on the business itself.
I love that. I mean, there's so much data that's out there right now that people are willingly put out. Why not take a look at it just for safety standpoint? Because most companies don't know what to do if there is a situation like that.
Sure.
I worked at a company once where a guy came in for an interview, and so this is like 2016. So like it wasn't that long ago. Guy
Sure.
came in for an interview and he ended up pushing the interviewee, no, the guy who worked for us that was interviewing him, who would have been his boss, he pushed him up against the wall. And then he like made another comment to someone, and like everybody at the organization was like, what do I do? Besides just like get security, get this guy out of here. Like like he made it into the building with that. Like if we were able to monitor his content, we might be able to say that this is not a very hinged individual.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, it's one of these things where, unfortunately, everybody's got their own story, and again, I often, kind of counsel our clients on the fact that, these are things that employers have cared about for decades, right? Identifying workplace violence, identifying threats. This is not new, to the, I would say, global professional workforce, but the method that the signal comes in, the way that the signal appears now is a little bit different than it was, 15 or 20 years ago, right? Where you might have someone who overhears someone talking about something in a cafeteria or in a break room or something like that. Whereas now that sort of thing is happening online, right? So being able to collect the signal that exists out there, and keep in mind too, the really unique thing about this is that anyone that we screen is an existing employee. You've obtained their consent, right? So these people know that these checks are happening, right? And so it's almost that extra layer of saying, hey, if you have the consent to run these sorts of checks, then you're still acting violent, you're still threatening people. That really shows kind of a disconnection from our perspective from what's appropriate in an organization and what is going to drive safety and security in that organization as well.
So I'm sure critics will be like, okay, you're Big Brother. You're looking at everybody and whatnot, but you're not going deep into anything that isn't tied to safety. You're not like
Yeah.
really, really monitoring everybody. You're just looking for these like kind of red flags.
Exactly, exactly. It's a fair concern, right? I think we've seen over the years a range of different companies who've used, data to surveil people without their consent, right? To do it in a way that, pulls out personal information or things related to a protected class. Someone's talking about someone's ethnicity, or maybe they're talking about their own disability, or perhaps that they're pregnant or something like that. Things that really could delve into the world of being Big Brother. Why would an employer need to know that somebody is pregnant? Why would an employer need to know a person's disability and ethnicity, right? Why would they need to know about a life event like that? So really, from our perspective, it's twofold, right? Like there is a still, regardless, despite those compliance concerns, a need for businesses to identify these sorts of risks and threats. And also, we would argue, for the employees at these companies too, to have a safe, welcoming, and a workplace, I would say, that reflects the standard of well-being that so many of us have come to expect. So, that's why it is so important, to make sure you're getting people's consent when you're running these checks, right? To put this out in the open, to make sure that employees know that this is happening. But on the other side of it too, to your point, most importantly, this is where the AI comes in, right? The ability to, not label people and tell you who's a risk and who's not a risk, who's a good person, who's a bad person. No scoring in our methodology whatsoever, but instead we like to use kind of like a baseball analogy of calling balls and strikes, right? We're very good at being able to determine if someone is saying something on the internet like, my boss and I have this crazy project this weekend. I think we're going to kill it. I'm really excited about it. We're going to bring it home.
We are going to murder this product.
Totally. That's very different than, and I'll just use a similar type of syntax to point out the nuance here. That's very different than someone saying, my boss and I have this big project that we're working on this weekend. It's due. It's really not going my way. It exposed things I don't like about him, and I'm going to kill him this weekend, right? Like, I know that sounds like a little like tongue in cheek and funny, but that's the sort of stuff that we see, right? Like, that's the sort of stuff that we're able to pick out the signal amongst the noise, right? And so, it's really important to have a service provider, and not to toot our own horn too much, but a company like Fama that's been doing this for decades, labeling content, improving its algorithmic models so that it can identify for an employer a piece of content that's relevant to them so that they can take action on it using their own procedures and policies. But as soon as you delve in to the world of like scoring people or calling out who's a risk or who's not a risk, the explainability of the technology, the artificial intelligence that you're using is not only non-compliant, but also puts you in a position where, on the other side of it, how could you reasonably and consistently take action on that information if you can't even understand how that scoring methodology is happening? So you really just had to find, over the years, I would say, like the sweet spot of how customers use this product, how to deliver value, how to do it in a way that's fair to employees, fair to the companies who want this information, but also doing it all out in the open, so folks know that this is happening and have a peace and control in, how data is collected and used.
So most screening companies, they screen you on the front end. Once they get you in the door, goodbye. But this is a way for you to stay involved. It's smart. I don't know necessarily if anyone else is kind of doing this, but what is the landscape? Is there other providers that have kind of picked up on this ongoing monitoring?
Yeah, there are. It's one of these things, I think, in background screening that started emerging like in 2018, 2019. I'm kind of a old hat in background screening right now, which is funny because I knew nothing about the industry before I came in. But in the decade since we started the company, we've really become integrated into the industry, not just like the industry organizations, but working with, all the major partners, right? And talking to the investors, the companies, et cetera. And, monitoring is a thing, so to speak, and it happens in a few different functions. One, at kind of like a regulatory industry level and, transportation. There's MVR monitoring, for example. In healthcare, there's license monitoring that's available. There's also, in some businesses and in some organizations, what, companies like Equifax now offer. Used to be a company called Apris, but criminal monitoring, where they essentially monitor arrest databases around the country and can tell you very quickly if one of your employees was arrested and identify, very quickly thereafter if that arrest led to a conviction, right? And so that was a pretty big acquisition for Equifax. A few years ago, it was like a one point, I think, $2 or $3 billion acquisition by Equifax when they acquired Apris. So I think the size of that acquisition, Equifax getting involved, kind of states the emerging maturity of monitoring. But I think it's just shifted a lot as employers have become increasingly more distributed, more digital, more remote work. You're finding a less vertical organization, more horizontal organizations that have that kind of like federated and state model where maybe an office in Cleveland is maybe not operating under the same auspices as the Houston office or whatever it might be. And so when we talk to employers, it's interesting. We ask them, are you more concerned with, in simple terms, dodging a bullet on a new hire or a risk happening inside of your company right now? And for certain organizations, I would say like financial services, healthcare, you could point to like critical infrastructure like energy, utility, gas, and the public sector too. So working with a lot of law enforcement agencies, screening peace officers, there's a lot of concern about what's happening right now where the stakes are higher, for the employees that are working for your organization. But some of the smaller, SMB organizations, and I described the kind of, staffing, retail, hospitality, maybe a little bit less concern there because turnover is so high and, there are concerns there already about just retaining employees regardless of, what's happening on the ground.
Well, I think so. I think because of all the advances in AI, we have this new. Well, it's not necessarily a new problem, but it's like the biggest issue I see right now is trust. Trust between the candidates that they're getting, the company that they think they're getting, and trust for the company that they're getting the candidate that they think they are. And so I feel like this is just adding to that. This is a nice fail safe. That okay, if you did make a mistake, everybody makes mistakes. You hired a guy
Yeah,
that was
totally.
awful. Um, He's probably in the White House now, but you hired that type of guy. Um, and but this will alert that and you'll stop it before anything else gets too bad.
Yeah, and also like keep in mind this is not always like, oh well, someone said something on the internet or made a post or said something to somebody and now we're going to fire them. This can be just as often used as a point of intervention. To say, hey, this is not the sort of way we want to treat each other at this company, right? Cut it out. It could be that simple, that kind of nudge, as it were, to bump somebody back into the right lane, is a area of behavioral intervention we see, all the time. But look, the facts remain that, if there are signals of potential risk that could have a regulatory impact on the industry that this, company is in, for example, things like workplace violence, things like theft, things like criminal activity and illegal drug use, right? Like those are things that in some jurisdictions in the UK right now for financial services firms, this is new legislation like just dropped in the first week of July. But, banks basically said, hey, look, if people are saying things that might be offensive to you, right? Or you as an employee at a company, maybe that's not something the bank is responsible for. But if a person saying something threatening potentially the regulatory environment in which the financial services firm operates, the bank is liable for that and responsible for that, right? And so employers are kind of caught between regulatory pressure that's guiding them and saying, look, these are things we have to start caring about identifying, and the method in which we identify them has evolved to reflect the changes in the workplace demographics that we talked about at the top. But it's a fast changing environment. It's really interesting. We're kind of like at this moment where the adoption curve is really picking up. It used to be like early adopters who were starting to do this stuff because they'd experienced something, but now we're, meaning they like reacted to something like my story. They turned on monitoring because they had a violent episode or something like that in their company. But now what we're seeing is more of the proactive approach of companies that are now beginning to say like, all right, let's start doing this before we've even had something happen to us, so that we're not liable in front of the regulators, because now the regulators are telling us we got to do this.
Yeah, and it's not just like the Facebooks, the Instagrams, LinkedIn. I'm sure. I mean, people should at this point realize that anything you say on those platforms is public. It's it's a representation
As long
of
as it's
you.
publicly available, you can make
Yeah.
stuff private on Facebook. You can make something private on every social media platform where no one can find it. So you can do that too. Like that's we're not friending people or trying to get it private. Yeah. Selling Facebook accounts that are friending people to folks, like that's just not what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like I look at the new generation that's out there, and like, so Facebook came out when I was in college. Like I was right there at that time, and then for the next like decade in my early work years, I put everything on Facebook. Everything I thought, everything I did. And I look back at that stuff 20 years later or something. I'm just like, ugh, like I don't like looking at the Facebook memories. I think what I like is that you're telling people right off the bat, hey, this is what we're looking for. It's a safety issue for us. It's also not just beyond safety. It's what if there's intellectual property, or like for example, smart recruiters just got
Yeah.
bought the other day.
Yep.
I heard I was listening to a podcast on them because I was diving into like the whole process and stuff, and
Yeah.
this was something that was openly talked about in the company. It was internal knowledge in February. If that gets out, and it's probably, I mean, there's rumors and stuff, but if you have an employee that's talking about this, or someone that just doesn't understand that could, the whole house could fall down if
Yeah.
this gets out. Like, you need to be able to be aware of that. And plus, if your companies, I know when I worked at Global Force back in the day when we were going IPO, it didn't. We pulled out. We pulled out of the IPO while I was on the train going down to New York. That was a fun day. Good learning experience for me. But you don't want anything to jeopardize a bigger business deal.
Yeah, look, and you're pointing at, I think, kind of the key element here of what I would call, again, ongoing employee screening, talent screening. I think even the term monitoring, why I'm not using it, it kind of begets this like perception of what what the user thinks is happening or what the employee thinks is happening, right? I think it's really interesting as far as like brand trust and customer trust that employers, but also like the employees of these companies have to have. Because I think, to your point, like, I can't imagine an organization that, and I'm sure there are some that are out there, the super, it's not even really like free speech because it's private sector and not the government, but
So Wall Street.
there's certain mindsets that are like, no matter what we say, we should be able to say and do whatever we want. But I would imagine the majority of employees at companies would be okay with monitoring for, workplace violence, IP theft, criminal behavior, right? Like, so many of us, you use the IPO example, of all the people at Smart Recruiters that like busted their butts over the years, and I know some of them personally, to get the company to where it was, to be able to get that sale off the ground, to have that disintermediated by somebody leaking information out and crashing enterprise value, or, somewhat reason or another having, SAP back out of the deal, right? Like, that would be terrible for so many of the employees that have, again, worked for so long to generate that outcome for the organization. And on top of it too, this question of workplace safety, right? And so it really does, in our universe, come down to like the nuance of what you're doing, how you're doing it, the consent oriented nature, behind it, right? And so it's just interesting as a service provider in the industry, how much trust you have to build with employees and with employers of being candid, having conversations like this one, and being candid about what it is and what it isn't, right? Acknowledging and recognizing that monitoring people for like what their political beliefs are, or what, you know, jokes they're making, or people trolling people on the internet, right? That those are the sorts of things that I think employers can conflate sometimes the wider net that they cast, or the finer filter that they cast for pre-employment compared to what's happening with existing employee screening. And I would argue that applies like to all other types of existing employee screening as well. But even the term monitoring itself kind of has this like icky 1984 feeling associated with it. So you're kind of fighting this like legacy brand perception of what it is versus what it isn't, and putting that out in the open, I think, is the first path, a transparent path to generating buy-in from employers and employees.
Well, you can't argue safety. You can't argue like that's not a bipartisan
I agree with
take
you.
or anything. It's basic public safety. And so like I know you probably can't talk about the details. I don't want the details, but just like tell me through, like talk to me, because this is a major thing that you guys were able to do, is stop a workplace shooting. Like talk to
Yeah.
me about how that all like came together.
Yeah, look, I can't get into the fundamental details of exactly what happened and how it went down, but this was an organization that had used Fama for pre-employment screening for some time, and they started monitoring even I catch myself in saying it, they started screening their existing employee base because they had concerns. There were concerns specifically about certain groups of employees, and this was a large organization that had a range of different employee types. That I'll just say high level was in the field of manufacturing,
Yeah.
and there were a lot of people in different types of jobs, some using heavy machinery, some that were corporate and back office, right? And so the general idea here was that they had some concerns. There were some questions that had found their way through, let's just say, like anonymous HR reporting channels, and they decided that they wanted to really get a sense of what was going on to prevent the worst outcome from happening. And sure enough, they identified somebody that was posting things on the internet that were naming certain executives, that were speaking in terms that were extremely violent, and essentially using terminology that, upon further review, made it clear that this person, needed help, and luckily they were able to intervene and help this person, get the care they needed before something really bad happened. So, the important thing is, we're not saying like, hey, this person could be a workplace shooter, or this person could be violent. But what we are saying is that here is someone that is making violent threats on the internet. Here are the threats they are making. Here's the context of the conversation. Here's the frequency with which these threats have appeared. We're going to leave it to you, employer, to make the judgment about how you'd like to proceed, right? And so, that's I think where service providers in the world of AI are really going to start drifting, is how do you bring your users to the precipice of action? How do you fill in the gaps in their own decision-making process? How do you give them the evidence, give them the foundation so that they can drive their own, in this case, ER, employee relations, and, legal, in this case, law enforcement, process, right? And so employers know what to do with this information. Like, let's just be very clear. Like, employers know that if someone makes a violent threat, like, we all have that training. That's like HR, 101 for a lot of folks, right? Some of the first things you learn when you get into, I'll say not TA, but when you get into developing a handbook and policies and procedures from a data continuity or incident management perspective, right? That could be technical, that could be in the workplace. So employers know what to do with this information. I think that's an important piece, is like, employers are not like neophytes to the idea. If someone makes a violent threat, if it's overheard, right? Imagine somebody saying something on video, or, writing an email on, corporate, chat or something like that, that makes a violent threat. That stuff gets flagged right now. That's being flagged already, right? So I just think you got to give the employer credit too, that they know what they're doing, and you know they can action on this information in a way that's appropriate, that in this case, helped avoid a material negative impact. So
And I just like anybody that's out there thinking that they could be, this ongoing monitoring. Yes, you don't want someone to be monitoring, just like you don't want your
yeah,
manager to be monitoring over your shoulder. But this was already a concern. that was brought forth, and then it just gave some more context to this
Yeah.
particular person. So I think, nobody wants to sit around and look at everybody else's Facebook feeds or whatever. I know Facebook in the past 5 years has just told me how stupid everyone I know is, and like I spend half my time unfollowing people because I don't want to see
I'm glad we're not friends on Facebook, because I don't ever
it.
put
You
some.
would be fine. These
All
are
right,
like old people in my life from like 15 years ago that I'm like, yeah, I don't really need
I
this
got you.
anymore. Yeah,
I got
but
you.
it's just it's a wild world right now, but it's a good thing that your company is, you know, keeping things beyond the hire, that
Mm.
you're continuing your service to the client. Um, what do you think is going to happen like in the future? Let's put on your like little fortune teller hat, and what do you think that do you think that this monitoring is going to take off? Do you think that what's the next kind of big thing that's out there? I mean, it's a broad question, but I'm just
Yeah,
curious
sure.
from your standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's like this need and desire for, CEOs in certain industries to like try to go after the whole world, right? And try to get, everyone. And of course, in my dream of dreams, if everybody was using this product, and do I believe in it? 1,000%. Have I seen the value every day? Without a doubt. But, I think the more realistic way to answer your question is like, in what industries is this going to take off, right? I don't think like monitoring is going to take off in, again, like retail or, hospitality or staffing, just for the sake of staffing, right? Like I think the bigger question is going to be at the industry level. I think you're going to see in certain industries like financial services, healthcare, I'll just say like critical infrastructure more
Yep.
generally, that there is a increasingly regulated environment on safety and security, that and I would just say like regulatory compliance more generally, and that could be on everything from, people in finance talking about trades they're working on, insider information, leaking deal details, etc. I think you're going to see more and more employers begin drifting towards a, lightweight, not real-time monitoring, not listening to everybody says, but, an ongoing cadence of monthly rescreening, quarterly rescreening on signals of risk that are going to, again, reflect the majority of their workforce. We often talk about, I mentioned at the top, but like, if 50% of the workforce today is Gen Z and millennial, and like you, right, you and me, we got our Facebook accounts. I remember I got to college, it was like the first thing
Yep.
you got was a Facebook account, right? And, we represent a good portion of the emerging bulk of the professional workforce in the United States. Millennials are, again, 50% combined with Gen Z of the workforce today. That number is going to climb to 70% by 2030. Then you got Gen Alpha, who I think this summer, yeah, because 2010, I think this summer, 14 and 15-year-olds were starting to get internships, summer jobs, et cetera. I mean, I started working like around 13 or 14. So, then you have that being 70% of the world's population, right? And so we take a really zoomed out view of saying, like, what's the workforce going to look like in 2030? It's going to be very few baby boomers who are in the market. Gen X is going to, slowly begin, retiring and coming off the market, at that time too. And you're going to see the vast majority of the workforce as these people who've spent their lives online just as much as offline, right? And so I think you'll see employers begin adjusting their screening toolkit in a way that reflects, those demographic changes. So I think if I had to have a crystal ball, my most important question is like, what's the character and the profile, the demographic of the people that are working in your company, right? How do these people live their lives? Where do they spend their time? And how do you adopt your screening technology in a way to reflect those changes that you're seeing in the workplace? So I don't think it's anything super complicated. And I think the first adopters are going to be in like financial services, healthcare, and what I'll just call like public sector. So
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. So we're coming up on time, but what have you got going on in the fall? Are you going to be at HR Tech? Are you going to be at RecFest?
yeah, we're going to be at HR Tech. We're doing a big splash at HR Tech this year. So fired up for that one. So I'll be there. Are you going to be
All
there
right,
too?
I will be there. I'll be there with my little mobile podcast setup, which is essentially this thing.
Uh,
And
love it.
yeah,
So yeah, I'll be at HR Tech. We can definitely hang when we're there. But I've got a lot of events through the fall. We're sponsoring a executive search event over in the UK with a new partnership. We're super excited to announce that'll be coming out, I think, in a week or so. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, got a lot going on. But mostly as far as big conferences, HR Tech is the big one we're attending this year.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben Mones from Fama. Thanks for joining Totally Talent, and you have yourself a wonderful weekend.
Appreciate it, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for tuning in to the Totally Talent podcast by HR.com. We hope you find today's episode insightful and inspiring. Don't forget to explore more episodes and discover valuable resources at hr.com/podcasts, where you can listen to all of our podcasts. Until next time, keep leading with purpose and making a difference in the world of talent.